Hello learners. Today we will be talking about contemporary period in the history of English literature. The contemporary period in English literature is an era of disorder and turbulence, and you could find loss of human values, and there were lots of challenges, destruction as well as construction. It begins with the Second World War, which left a glory trail of death and destruction, resulting in the reshaping of the entire political map of the world. The invasion of Russia by Hitler in 1941, as well as the Americas joining the war in 1942, were the momentous events of this period. After the death of George VI in 1952, Elizabeth II came to the throne of England. And this particular year, 1956, was a turning point in British history because England entered the atomic era. During this year, the Queen opened the world's first nuclear power station. And in 1963, Britain also signed a limited nuclear test ban treaty with USA and again with USSR. And to note a few things like capital punishment was abolished in 1969, and W.H. Hudson quotes, "It was certainly an exciting age for writers, an age which marked a definite break with the past, a challenge to authority, an assertion in the right to be in thought and form, romantic, realistic, passionate, and it was a self conscious age when writers were intensely critical of the composition of society and were beginning to be the critical of the individual self." Next, we talk about poetry of the contemporary period. The four great poets of this period are W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, C.D. Lewis, and Louis MacNeice, and they were known as the Oxford poets who brought a new awareness to English poetry. And these poets firmly grappled with the contemporary political and social tensions. The political atmosphere was tenser and darker due to the rise of Hitler, fascism in Italy, there was growing unemployment, and all these things, and even industrial policies to be included. And these four Oxford poets were called as the four musketeers of the Oxford movement, and these poets had much in common. All of them were Oxford graduates and had been great friends when they were undergraduates, and we could find that their thematic content contained lots of innovation and experimental modernness, and they had more intellectual and less emotional appeal, and their political involvement with communism and and their political involvement with communism was born a sense of guilt and involvement. And to all these poets, Sigmund Freud was the influence, and their common identity was reflected in their satire. Their poetic technique was greatly influenced by Imagism, French symbolism, and Hopkins, and as well as T.S. Eliot's innovations. W.H. Auden, his poems are published in 13th of the 20th century, where it talks about the post-war civilization. Poems, the orators, the dance of death were few of his works, which show the influence of Freud and Marx, and these works express the contemporary political tensions, social and economic unrest. He was a great poet, artist, and experimenter in verse form, and Stephen Spender calls W.H. Auden as the most accomplished technician now writing poetry in English. Coming to Stephen Spender, he is a distinguished poet who wrote about social and political realities because communism and left wing politics attracted him, and his poetry, though intellectual and unemotional, but it shows deep empathy with the essential human condition. His poems were published in Poems of 1933, and you have Vienna, The Still Center, The Edge of Being, Generous Days, and Collected Poems. He beautifully expressed his personal emotions in short lyrics, and thus Spender was an accomplished poetic artist who used exact words. And next we see Cecil D. Lewis, where he appeared as a brilliant critic in A Hope for Poetry, one of his works. And he has also written other works like Starting Point, The Poetic Image. He is a poet who is remembered most for the particular work From Feathers to Iron and The Magnetic Mountain. And he also wrote under the influence of Hopkins, Eliot, and sometimes Auden, and is very modern in his approach. Louis MacNeice, his poetic output consists of poems The Earth Compels, Plant and Phantom, Autumn Sequel, and The Burning Perch. And he was not wholeheartedly committed to the ideology of communism, but he poignantly expressed the anguish of the age of mission in his poetry. He is a great and gifted artist, and he also made use of the musical potentiality of language. And thus, contemporary poetry is read by a minority audience, and there was a common change where sometimes it is obscure, and sometimes it was very harsh, and sometimes very rude and straightforward. And next we come to a group of poets called war poets. We would discuss Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen in this category, where the First World War brought to public notice many poets, particularly among men in the armed forces, where they were the new source of inspiration for the writers of established reputation. And Rupert Brooke, though his war poetry is small in bulk, he is usually considered typical of the early group of war poets. And his poetry is essentially that of a young, cultured man of leisure. The ease and simplicity of his verse is considered to be his metrical skill, and thus he had a reputation very deserved for sentimentality, and his reaction against his attitude to war was portrayed in his works. And he has written few works like collected poems, and one critical work, John Webster and his Elizabethan drama. It indicates a real appreciation of the dramatist and his period. Letters from America is his other prose work. Siegfried Sassoon, he saw infantry service in Western Europe and Palestine, and counterattack one of his violent, embittered poems. It confirmed the notoriety where it you could find in the contemporary periodicals of that particular time. And he is the one who painted the horrors of life and death in the trenches, dugouts, hospitals, and how war has left a merciless and the calculated realism, which we could find in his war poetry. And he has written few works like war poems, satirical poems, Heart's Journey, and a few other works. Wilfred Owen was the greatest of the war poets, and he himself wrote once, he says about himself, I am not concerned with poetry, my subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity, and never has the pity of war been more deeply felt or more powerfully shown. Though Wilfred Owen's satire is often sharp, he never loses his artistic poise, and his most bitter work has a dignity which is truly great. And the poems of Wilfred Owen is a much more a complex collection of his works, and contains an excellent memoir by Edmund Blunden. And thus, we move to the next important movement called apocalyptic movement. It was a short-lived poetic movement of the 40s of the 20th century. It was influenced by the Book of Revelation, Shakespeare, Blake, Kafka, Donne, Hopkins, and Dylan Thomas. It was a natural development from the surrealism of the 40s, and the mood of the violence that began to creep into the fabric of the poetry. And it was opposed to the mission age, and thus you could find a few people like Henry Trees and who edited the New Apocalypse and the White Horsemen were the pioneers of this movement. And you also have other important people like J.F. Henry, Nicholas Moore, G.S. Fraser, and Vernon Watkins. And apart from this, we had Second World War poets, and prose was the modern prose was so popular And thus we move to the major essayist of this particular period, where we have the prominent essayist of the century, G.K. Chesterton, E.V. Lucas, and A.G. Gardiner. Chesterton was foremost among the English essayists of early years of the 20th century. He was not an essayist, but we could call him as a phenomenon. As an essayist, he has a tremendous range, and he has always something original and startling to say about everything. Let it be witticisms, or his epigrams, or his satire, or his ingenious paradoxes. These would be the recurring features of his prose. And thus, as an example of paradox, consider his remark about the French Revolution. He once says, the greatest event in English history, which is French Revolution, but it actually occurred outside England. How true! And this is how Chesterton is unique in his style. And next we talk about E.V. Lucas, where he could be called as the Charles Lamb of the 20th century, and his adoration of the Prince of English essayist goaded him to write the authoritative life of Charles Lamb, and he also has edited a definitive edition of the works and letters of Charles and Mary Lamb. And in addition, he also wrote essays, travel books, and a few books about paintings. And he worked with several newspapers before becoming the assistant editor of The Punch. And his essays were a kind of entertainment, and it is full of common sense and humor, which could reflect the style and manner of Charles Lamb. Though his humor is general, but sometimes it is savage. And next we come to A.G. Gardiner, where his other name is Alpha of the Plough, was also a journalist, and he was an editor of the Daily News from 1902 to 1919, a paper to which J.K. Chesterton made regular contributions in his early career as an essayist. And A.G. Gardiner could write on almost everything that came his way, it can be umbrellas, pigs, pockets, beer, or porcelain. His prose is close to everyday language, very clear and informal, at the same time genial and energetic. He avoids difficult words, and in fact, he has written an essay on big words to justify his choice of simple and common diction. And he also distinguishes between what he calls as a fine use of words and the use of fine words, and thus he prefers always the fine use of words. And next we move to the major dramatist of the period, Harold Pinter, Carol Churchill, and Arnold Wesker. Harold Pinter is a playwright of international status who won Nobel Prize in Literature in 2005. In Britain, he is often called as the angry old man, and in the world at large, he is seen as a great writer and a champion of the oppressed. His famous plays include The Birthday Party, The Dumb Waiter, The Caretaker, The Homecoming, Old Times, and The Betrayal. And according to Edward Albert, he conveys, that is, Harold Pinter conveys the rambling ambiguities and silences of everyday conversation with an amazing authenticity that is obviously much influenced by Beckett, and uses them to build up the sense of menace and scarcely built violence which characterize the birthday party, the dumb waiter, and the caretaker. Next, we talk about Carol Churchill exposes the social system based on exploitation in the plays like Owners, Top Girls, Serious Money, and Mad Forest. And the women characters emerge as the victim of a culture which has regarded them merely as, you could say, commodities, or which has conditioned them to submit to the masculine social rules. And thus, Top Girls exposes the superficial liberation of women. And thus, Carol Churchill was a celebrated writer of the contemporary period. And Arnold Wesker, who was a realist, who has written The Kitchen, Roots, The Four Seasons, The Wedding Feast, Chips with Everything. He was a social realist with a sense of commitment, and that gave his plays a more a kind of positive quality. And The techniques of the drama, which includes dialogue or catastrophe, where you could find the modern dramas aim at realism and they try to reproduce the reality and the incompleteness of the practical life with lots of symbolism, portraying the inward conflict and elaborate stage directions. And I hope that you have understood the important poets and the major essayists and the dramatists of the contemporary period. Have a nice day and thank you.